"We have a surprise for you," Sophie announced, lifting her wine glass before I had even finished serving dessert. Her smile was polished, camera-ready, the kind she used in branded photos and holiday posts. "We sold our apartment," she continued brightly, "and we're moving into your house tomorrow." Nathan sat beside her, smiling as if he had just closed the best deal of his career. The room filled with polite laughter, someone clapped, and for a brief moment it almost felt like a celebration. I slowly folded my napkin, placed it beside my plate, and said in a calm voice that surprised even me, "That's very ambitious. But you might want a backup plan. If you've ever been informed about your own future without being consulted, stay with me. And if stories about dignity, boundaries, and quiet strategy resonate with you, consider subscribing, because what I said next that night didn't happen by accident. It was months in the making. But to understand how my son and daughter-in-law reached the point of announcing they were moving into my home without asking, you need to understand who I was before that dinner and what they underestimated. My name is Clara Bennett. I am 67 years old. I spent 32 years supervising municipal contracts, reviewing fine print others ignored, identifying liabilities before they became lawsuits. I learned long ago that most damage doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives disguised as opportunity. I was widowed 9 years ago. My husband, Edward Bennett, was a civil engineer who believed in layered ownership, diversified risk, and never building anything on a single point of failure. "Always structure it so no one can topple it in one move," he used to say. That philosophy built our house, and quietly it shaped my thinking long after he was gone. When Edward passed, the house became more than property. It became proof of discipline. It was paid off, structured carefully, every improvement documented, every asset categorized. I did not stay in this house because I was sentimental. I stayed because it was stable. Nathan, my only son, was 30 then, charming, quick with numbers, gifted in commercial real estate. He could sell possibility better than most people could sell certainty. I admired that about him once. After he married Sophie, something shifted, not suddenly but gradually, like a thermostat being turned up 1 degree at a time. Sophie works in brand marketing. She understands presentation, optics, narrative framing. She believes image is momentum. She once said at dinner, "If you're not upgrading, you're stagnating." I remember thinking that stability and stagnation are not the same thing, but I didn't argue. At first, their visits increased after Edward's death. They brought flowers, organic pastries, expensive candles that smelled like coastal resorts. Sophie would sit at my kitchen island and look around thoughtfully. "It's such a large house for one person," she would say gently. "Do you ever feel lonely here?" Nathan would add, "Maintenance must be exhausting." I answered politely, "I never explained that loneliness is not solved by downsizing. That maintenance is cheaper than dependency." The conversations became more specific. "The market is strong," Nathan mentioned one Sunday afternoon. "You could easily sell for above asking." Sophie chimed in, "You could get something modern. Security building, concierge, minimal upkeep, a lifestyle upgrade." Upgrade, that word appeared often. They never said, "We need your house." They said, "You deserve better." It was subtle, strategic. Questions designed to reposition my thinking. But I have reviewed too many contracts to miss patterns. Then came the first pivot. "We've been thinking," Nathan said casually over coffee one evening, "what if we sold our apartment? With your house equity combined, we could consolidate into something substantial. A multi-generational investment." Multi-generational? I noticed he said investment, not home. Sophie smiled. "It would make so much financial sense. One property, shared equity, everyone wins." Everyone wins. I did not respond immediately. Silence unsettles people who expect enthusiasm. "Interesting," I said finally. "Run the numbers." They did. Presentations appeared, forecasts. Charts, appreciation projections. I listened. I asked questions. I did not commit. Over the following months, urgency increased. Their apartment was too small. Their building was declining. The neighborhood was losing value. Sophie mentioned that several of her clients were upgrading. "Perception matters," she said. "You don't want to look stuck." Stuck, another word carefully chosen. I began observing more than listening. New designer pieces appeared in Sophie's wardrobe. Nathan upgraded his car. Weekend getaways showed up on social media. The lifestyle did not match the narrative of constraint. Meanwhile, their tone shifted. Less suggestion, more assumption. When we move in, Sophie said one afternoon while measuring my dining room with her eyes, we could convert this into an open concept space. When we move in. I looked at her and smiled faintly. That's a bold timeline, she laughed. We're manifesting. Manifestation, I have learned, often translates to expectation. The real turning point happened quietly. Nathan called one evening. We sold the apartment, he said. I paused. Already? Yes, he replied quickly. Cash offer, it happened fast. We close in 30 days. And where will you live? I asked. There was a brief silence. With you, of course, temporarily. Until we purchase something larger, it's the logical solution. Logical, that word again. Did you discuss this with me? I asked evenly. We're family, Mom, I assumed. Assumption is not agreement. But I did not say that. Instead, I said, we'll talk at dinner. And so that dinner was scheduled. Sophie insisted on inviting a few friends to celebrate new beginnings. I prepared lamb just as I had when Edward was alive. I set the table carefully. I polished the silver, not because I was surrendering, but because clarity deserves composure. As guests filled the room that night and Sophie lifted her glass to announce their surprise, I watched faces glow with admiration. I watched Nathan's pride. I watched the narrative forming in the room before I had spoken a word. I understood something in that moment. They believed I would not disrupt the script. They believed politeness equals compliance. They believed my quiet nature meant I would adapt. But they misunderstood one essential truth about me. Silence is not weakness. It is preparation. When I folded my napkin and said, you might want a backup plan, the temperature shifted slightly. Sophie laughed nervously. What do you mean? She asked. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and said, because decisions about this house were made months ago. Nathan's smile faltered. Sophie's grip tightened on her glass. The guests exchanged glances. What decisions? Nathan asked carefully. I took a sip of water before answering. The kind that don't require public announcements. And that was when the celebration began to unravel, though none of them yet understood how far ahead the unraveling had already begun. They said they were moving in tomorrow. What they didn't know was that 3 months earlier I had already moved the house somewhere they couldn't reach. If you've ever felt pressure disguised as family concern, stay with me, because the most dangerous decisions are the ones made when you feel rushed. And what happened next didn't begin at that dinner table. It began long before Sophie lifted her glass. After Nathan first mentioned consolidating assets, I didn't argue, I didn't accuse, I didn't resist. I did what I have always done when something feels structurally unsound. I reviewed the foundation. I started by examining patterns, their spending, their urgency, their language. Nathan began speaking less like a son and more like a broker pitching a development. Equity efficiency, capital redeployment, underutilized square footage. Sophie spoke in lifestyle slogans. You deserve better flow, modern living, multi-generational synergy. Words are rarely accidental, especially when repeated. The real shift happened the afternoon Sophie brought printed floor plans of my house with sections highlighted. If we knock down this wall, she said lightly, we could create a shared common space. It's outdated as it is. I remember touching the edge of the paper and thinking, they are already renovating something they don't own. That evening, I went upstairs, opened Edward's old filing cabinet, and removed a leather folder labeled structure. Edward believed in layered protection. When we bought this house 40 years ago, he insisted on structuring ownership conservatively. Never let the asset sit exposed, he used to say. Back then I thought he was overly cautious. Now I understood he was patient. I reviewed the deed, clear, solely in my name after his passing. No encumbrances, no joint claims. No leverage points. But I knew something else. Pressure does not need legal standing to be effective. Emotional leverage is often stronger than contractual leverage. So I called someone I hadn't spoken to in almost a year. Martin Feldman, early 70s, estate attorney, quiet voice, ruthlessly precise mind. He had handled Edward's estate when he passed. Martin, I said over the phone, I need to review something hypothetical. He chuckled softly. Hypotheticals are usually very specific, Claire. 2 days later, I sat across from him in his office. I explained everything without embellishment. The urgency, the apartment sale, the assumption of moving in. The subtle language shift from suggestion to expectation. Martin listened without interruption. When I finished, he folded his hands and asked one question. Do you want to keep control of this property? Yes, I answered without hesitation. Then we act before the narrative escalates, he replied. He outlined 3 options. Sell, gift partial equity, or restructure. Selling would give me liquidity but reduce stability. Gifting equity would create legal vulnerability. Restructuring would maintain control while eliminating exposure. What does restructuring look like? I asked. He leaned back. You place the property into an irrevocable trust, structured so you retain lifetime residency rights. After your lifetime, distribution follows your terms, not anyone else's expectations. And during my lifetime, no one can compel sale, no one can leverage occupancy rights. No one can override your authority. I felt something settle inside me, not anger, not fear, clarity. How quickly can it be done? I asked. Martin smiled slightly. Faster than family meetings? Over the next 6 weeks, we drafted documents. Quietly, precisely. The Bennett Residential Trust was formed. The house transferred into it. I retained full lifetime occupancy and decision authority. Upon my passing, the asset would be liquidated and distributed, structured percentages, not assumptions. Nathan would receive a portion, not control, not majority, a portion. The rest allocated to a housing stability nonprofit Edward once admired. Layered ownership, just like Edward taught. The transfer was completed 2 weeks before Nathan called to say they had sold their apartment. They had no idea. Meanwhile, their behavior intensified. Sophie began referencing timeline urgency. We close in 30 days, she reminded me casually. Nathan mentioned storage solutions. We can move some of our things here early. I responded with the same sentence every time. We'll discuss it at dinner. The dinner became their stage. They assumed it would be my concession. What they didn't know was that it was my disclosure. Back at the table that night, after I said decisions had been made months ago, Nathan leaned forward, confusion tightening his expression. What decisions? He asked carefully. Sophie's voice was thinner now. Claire, what do you mean? I looked at them both, not with anger but with steadiness. This property was transferred into a trust 3 months ago, I said. Silence hit the room like a dropped plate. Sophie blinked. A trust? Yes, Nathan's jaw stiffened. Why would you do that without telling us? Because it required no consultation, I replied calmly. It is my property. Sophie forced a smile. Well, that's fine, it doesn't change anything. We're family. It changes everything, I said quietly. No one moves into this house without my consent. No structural modifications. No shared equity. No assumption of future inheritance. The word inheritance landed harder than I intended, but it was necessary. Nathan exhaled sharply. Are you saying you don't trust us? I held his gaze. Trust does not eliminate structure. Structure protects relationships. That was the moment the celebration fully fractured. Guests shifted uncomfortably. Sophie's posture stiffened. We already sold our apartment, she said. We're closing tomorrow. You made that decision independently, I replied, just as I made mine. Nathan's charm faded. Where exactly are we supposed to go? There it was, the pivot from strategy to victimhood. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I said something Edward once told me during a downturn in the market. Never liquidate an asset without securing your next position. Nathan stared at me, realizing I was quoting his father. The air thickened. Sophie's voice dropped its polish. So you're just leaving us stranded? I placed my hands gently on the table. No, I am refusing to be maneuvered. There is a difference. Sophie's expression hardened. Nathan looked caught between embarrassment and anger. And in that suspended silence, I realized something else. They had never actually believed I would say no. Not clearly, not publicly, not calmly, but here is what neither of them understood yet, and what would truly change everything. Restructuring the trust was only the first move. Because while they were planning to move in, I had already begun planning to move forward. And when they discovered where I was going next, the surprise would not belong to them. They thought the trust was the surprise. It wasn't. The real surprise was where I was going next. If you've ever had someone calculate your life as if it were their asset, stay with me, because sometimes the strongest move isn't defending your ground. It's choosing new ground entirely. After I told Nathan and Sophie the house had been placed into a trust, the dinner dissolved quickly. Guests left in awkward clusters. Sophie barely said goodbye. Nathan lingered just long enough to ask, "Why would you do this without talking to me?" I answered the same way I would have answered in a contract dispute. Because ownership does not require consensus. He didn't like that. The next morning, my phone began vibrating before 8 a.m. Nathan. I let it ring once, twice, then I answered. His voice was controlled, but beneath it I could hear panic. "Mom, we close today, we don't have anywhere to go. You could at least let us stay temporarily." Temporarily is a flexible word, it stretches, it settles, it roots. "Nathan," I said evenly, "when you sold your apartment, you did not confirm housing with me. We assumed. Assumptions are not agreements." Silence followed. Then frustration. "So what are we supposed to do? Book a hotel indefinitely?" Sophie's voice entered the call from the background. "This is unbelievable." I let them speak. When emotion rises, logic reveals itself. Finally, I said, "You are two capable professionals. You will find a solution." I ended the call gently, not abruptly. Calm is more destabilizing than anger. That afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table, the same table Sophie had measured with her eyes months earlier, and opened my laptop. I reviewed something I had been quietly researching for weeks. A coastal property 2 states away. Smaller, modern, efficient, not because I was running, but because I was no longer anchored to expectations that treated me as infrastructure. The idea had begun forming after my second meeting with Martin Feldman. "Claire," he had said carefully, "restructuring protects your house, but you also need to consider whether you still want this house." That question lingered. Did I want it, or had I simply defended it because someone tried to claim it? Edward loved this house. We built it brick by brick with intention, but Edward also believed in evolution. "Assets should serve you," he once told me. "Not trap you." The coastal property was not extravagant. 2 bedrooms, secure building, walkable community, quiet. The view was open water, not dramatic cliffs or tourist chaos, just horizon, clean, expansive. I scheduled a private showing under my own name. No mention to Nathan, no mention to Sophie. The following weekend, I drove 3 hours alone. The building lobby was understated. The unit bright. Sunlight reflected across polished floors. As I stepped onto the balcony and looked at the water, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, not nostalgia, not grief, possibility. For 9 years after Edward's death, I remained here because stability felt like loyalty. But stability and stagnation are not the same. Sophie had once said stability equals stagnation. She was wrong. But ironically, she forced me to re-examine what stability truly meant for me, not for her. That evening, I called Martin. "If I sell the house," I asked, "does the trust complicate it?" "Not at all," he replied. "You control the trust. It was structured precisely for flexibility." I hesitated before asking the next question. "If I sell, the proceeds remain within the trust?" "Correct, fully protected." "Fully directed by you?" I didn't answer immediately, then I said, "Prepare sale contingencies." 2 days later, Nathan called again. This time the tone had shifted. Less anger, more urgency. "We're staying at a short-term rental," he said tightly. "It's expensive." I listened. "We're trying to close on another property quickly, but inventory is low. It would have been easier if we could have leveraged your equity like we discussed." There it was again, leverage. "Nathan," I said calmly, "equity is not communal by default." "You're punishing us," Sophie's voice cut in from speakerphone. "No," I said quietly, "I am protecting myself." Sophie laughed sharply. "From what?" "Your own family?" I did not react. "From decisions made under pressure." The conversation ended without resolution. Over the next 2 weeks, I listed my house privately, no public signage, no neighborhood speculation. Martin coordinated the paperwork. I instructed the realtor, discretion only. Within 10 days, 3 offers arrived. The market was strong. The highest bid exceeded expectation. When I signed the acceptance documents, I felt neither triumph nor sadness. I felt alignment. Nathan found out accidentally. A colleague mentioned the property quietly circulating. His call came within minutes. "Is our house on the market?" he demanded. I noted the word. "Yes," I said, silence, then disbelief. "You're selling it?" "Yes. You said you structured it to keep control." "I did." Then why sell? Because I am not required to remain in place simply to prove a point. But I didn't say that aloud. Instead, I said, because I want to. Sophie took the phone. So this is revenge, she snapped. You can't control us, so you're liquidating. I let her words hang. Sophie, I said evenly, this decision began long before dinner. She scoffed. You're overreacting to nothing. I almost smiled. Nothing, months of assumption, public announcement, structural entitlement, that is not nothing. When is the closing? Nathan asked, voice tight. 30 days. Where will you go? He pressed. I paused deliberately. That's already arranged. The line went quiet, and in that silence I heard something shift, not just in them but in me. For years after Edward died, I feared becoming invisible. Now I realized invisibility can be power when chosen. They had mistaken my quiet for passivity. They had mistaken my stability for dependency. But they forgot something essential about contracts and about mothers. We learn, we adapt, we restructure. That night I stood in the center of my living room. Boxes had not yet appeared. Walls were unchanged. The house looked exactly as it always had, but it was no longer an anchor. It was a completed chapter. Edward's framed photograph sat on the mantel. I picked it up and ran my thumb across the glass. Layered ownership, he used to say. I smiled faintly. Layered life, I whispered back. The following morning, I wired the deposit for the coastal property. It was done. The sale, the purchase, the transition, but Nathan and Sophie still believed the trust was the full story. They did not yet understand that when someone pressures you into defending something, you sometimes discover you no longer need it at all. And when they find out where I am moving and why, they will finally understand that preparation is louder than reaction. They thought I sold the house out of spite. They had no idea I had already bought another one. If you've ever been forced to defend your boundaries so fiercely that you discovered you were ready for a new life altogether, stay with me. Because sometimes the real power move isn't keeping what's yours, it's choosing something better. The closing date approached quietly, no sign in the yard, no neighborhood gossip. Just paperwork moving in precise silence, exactly the way I preferred it. Nathan called twice that week. I didn't avoid him, but I didn't chase him either. Our conversations had become transactional, stripped of warmth. Mom, he began during one call, we heard the buyer is relocating from out of state. That's a fast turnaround. You didn't even give us time to process. Process what? A decision that was never yours, but I didn't say that. Nathan, I replied evenly, the market was favorable, I acted accordingly. Where are you staying? Sophie asked from the background, her voice sharper than usual. You can't just float between hotels. I almost smiled. They still imagined chaos because they equated control with proximity. I won't be floating, I said calmly. Everything is structured. Sophie exhaled dramatically. Structured, of course. She meant it as mockery. To me, it was affirmation. That weekend, I invited them to dinner. Not because I needed approval, but because clarity deserves witnesses. The house was already half packed, books in labeled boxes, artwork carefully wrapped. Nathan noticed immediately. You're really leaving? He muttered. Sophie scanned the room, eyes calculating what remained. This feels rushed, she said. It's not rushed, I corrected. It's deliberate. We sat at the dining table, fewer chairs now, no clutter, no excess. Just 3 plates in clean lines. I poured water, no wine. This wasn't a celebration, it was disclosure. I close next Thursday, I began. Nathan nodded stiffly. And after that, I held his gaze. I'm relocating. Relocating where? Sophie asked quickly. I paused long enough to let the weight of it settle. Seabrook Cove, coastal community 3 hours south. Silence. Nathan blinked. You bought another house? Yes. Sophie leaned back, arms crossed. With the proceeds? With a portion, I replied. The rest remains protected within the trust. Nathan's jaw tightened. You didn't mention buying anything. You didn't ask about my plans, you asked about my equity. That landed. Sophie's tone sharpened. So this is permanent, you're just moving away. I am moving toward something, I corrected. Not away. Nathan looked around the room where he had grown up. You always said you'd stay here. I also said I valued independence, I replied softly. Both can evolve. He stood and walked to the window, staring at the yard. So what happens now? The question carried more than logistics. It carried fear. I answered with precision. Now you and Sophie secure housing that fits your means. You build equity responsibly, you create stability without borrowing it. Sophie's composure cracked slightly. We never asked you to disappear. No, I said quietly. You asked me to absorb the risk so you wouldn't have to. That silence was heavier than any argument. Nathan turned back toward me. You think we're irresponsible. I think you're capable, I replied. But capability without discipline is expensive. He almost laughed at that almost. Instead, he sat down slowly. Dad would've, your father structured every asset with contingencies, I interrupted gently. He planned for worst-case scenarios. He never leveraged one property to prop up another unless both were secure. You know that? Nathan's shoulders dropped. He did know that. Sophie, however, shifted tactics. So what are we supposed to tell people? She asked. That you moved because you didn't want to help us? There it was again. Optics, narrative, brand management. You can tell people, I said calmly, that I chose a lifestyle aligned with my next chapter. Sophie's lips pressed thin. That sounds very curated. Everything intentional sounds curated, I replied. Dinner ended without raised voices. That was intentional too. They left with more questions than answers, and that was necessary. Because what they still didn't understand was this: I hadn't just protected my house. I had repositioned my life. Closing day arrived bright and unceremonious. Martin Feldman sat beside me at the long conference table, papers aligned. Signatures precise, funds transferred into the trust exactly as structured. You executed this well, Martin said quietly afterward. You were ready. Preparation is louder than reaction, I answered. He smiled faintly. Edward would agree. I drove south the next morning alone, no moving caravan, just essentials in the trunk. The new property wasn't grand, but it was efficient, sunlit, and entirely mine. Floor-to-ceiling windows faced the water. The air smelled clean. I stood in the empty living room and listened to the silence. It wasn't lonely, it was expansive. That evening, Nathan called. The new owners took possession, he said quietly. I drove by, I waited. It felt strange, he added. It's supposed to, I replied. Transitions always do, he hesitated. Are you happy? That question surprised me, not because of the words, but because of the sincerity. I looked out at the horizon beyond my balcony. Yes, I said truthfully. I am. Sophie didn't speak during that call. I suspect she was calculating what this meant for their plans, because now there was no fallback address. No symbolic anchor to leverage in conversations with lenders. No family property to reference at networking dinners. There was only their own structure, and structures built without subsidy require maturity. The following week, I received a message from Sophie. Short, polite, controlled. We found a smaller condo within budget, closing in 60 days. I read it twice. Smaller, within budget, no mention of loans. No mention of expectations. Progress rarely announces itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives disguised as inconvenience. I replied simply, that sounds appropriate. She did not respond, and that was fine. Because what they still don't fully understand is this: I didn't move to punish them. I moved because defending myself reminded me that I was still capable of expansion. And when they visit this new place for the first time, and they'll realize something else entirely. The house they thought defined my stability was never the source of my strength. They thought distance would weaken me. It did the opposite. If you've ever been told that your strength comes from what you own rather than who you are, stay with me, because the quietest seasons often reveal the loudest truths. Seabrook Cove was not dramatic. It didn't need to be. The mornings arrived softly, filtered through pale curtains and reflected off open water. No traffic noise, no doorbells, no unannounced expectations, just space. The first week after the move, my phone was unusually silent. No daily updates from Nathan. No strategic commentary from Sophie. I knew what that silence meant. They were adjusting to a world where I was no longer positioned as a financial contingency. On the 10th day, Nathan called. His tone was different, not demanding, not defensive, measured. We close on the condo next month, he said. It's smaller than we planned. Planned or imagined? I asked gently. He gave a short breath that might have been a laugh. Fair. There was a pause. Sophie isn't thrilled. Sophie prefers leverage, I said calmly. Stability feels slow to her. He didn't argue, that was new. Distance removes the urgency of immediate confrontation. Without proximity, conversations lose heat and gain clarity. That evening, I sat on my balcony and remembered something Edward used to say when Nathan was young and frustrated over losing a game. "Let him feel the loss," Edward would whisper to me. "He'll learn more from that than from rescuing him." At the time, I thought it was harsh. Now I understood it was discipline wrapped in love. 2 weeks later, Sophie sent a message. "We'd like to visit next weekend, if that's okay." Polite, careful, I read it twice. Not because I doubted the words, but because I recognized the shift. No entitlement, no assumptions, just a request. "That works," I replied. I didn't overextend, no emotional commentary. When they arrived that Saturday, they looked different. Not diminished, just recalibrated. Nathan carried a bottle of wine. Sophie wore neutral tones instead of curated statement pieces. Subtle signals, they stepped inside and paused. The open layout, the clean lines, the water stretching endlessly beyond glass. Sophie's eyes scanned, but not the way she used to scan my old house. This wasn't about evaluating asset potential. This was different. "It's peaceful," Nathan said quietly. "Yes," I replied, "it is." We sat at the dining table, smaller than the old one, intentionally so. Sophie ran her hand lightly along the surface. "You didn't downsize emotionally," she said before she could stop herself. I met her gaze. I realigned. She didn't respond, but something softened in her expression. Over lunch, Nathan spoke about their new condo. "It forced us to budget properly," he admitted. "We realized how much we were leaking every month." Sophie looked down at her plate, then up at me. "We were chasing optics," she said quietly. That was the closest she had come to confession. I didn't press. When people arrive at insight on their own, you let them hold it. After dessert, Nathan walked onto the balcony with me. The wind carried salt and distance. "Mom," he began carefully, "did you move because of us?" The honest answer was layered, but I gave him the clean version. "I moved because I realized I was staying out of habit, not desire." He nodded slowly. "I thought you were punishing us." "Punishment is reactive," I replied. "This was preparation." He absorbed that. Behind us, Sophie stood in the living room, looking not at the furniture but at the horizon. She seemed smaller somehow. Not in status, in armor. Before they left, Sophie lingered near the doorway. "I misjudged you," she said quietly, no performance, no defensiveness. "I thought stability meant fear of growth." I held her eyes. "Stability means choice?" She nodded once. That was enough. After they drove away, I didn't feel victory. I felt equilibrium. They had expected collapse when they removed themselves from my orbit. Instead, they found expansion. And in that expansion, they were forced to examine themselves. A week later, Martin Feldman called to confirm the trust allocations were updated with the new property. "Everything remains protected," he said. "As it should," I replied. Protection was no longer about defense. It was about intention. Nathan began calling occasionally, not to discuss property values or refinancing strategies, but to ask about the community here, about the walking trails, about whether I'd joined any local groups. The conversations were lighter, more human. Sophie sent photos of their new condo. Smaller, yes, but organized, thoughtful, sustainable. "We're furnishing it slowly," she wrote once. No rush. That sentence told me everything. Growth rarely happens in dramatic confrontations. It happens when expectations fail and people are forced to build from their own foundation. But something else was unfolding beneath the surface. Because while Nathan and Sophie were adjusting to their new reality, they hadn't yet asked the question that matters most. Not about money, not about property, about legacy. And when that conversation comes, and it will, they're going to realize that layered ownership applies to more than assets. It applies to relationships too, and not every layer is automatic. Some must be earned. They finally stopped asking about what I would give them and started asking what I was building. If you've ever wondered whether boundaries destroy families or refine them, stay with me, because what happened next changed the tone of everything. It began with a call from Nathan on a quiet Tuesday evening. No urgency, no strategic undertone, just a simple, "Do you have a minute?" I was seated on my balcony watching the tide shift against the shoreline. "I do," I said. He hesitated longer than usual. "Sophie and I met with our financial advisor today." That caught my attention. Nathan had always preferred operating independently, confident in his instincts. "And," I prompted. He asked about our long-term structure, retirement projections, estate planning, contingencies. He paused. It made me realize we never really thought beyond acquisition. Acquisition, not preservation, not sustainability. Just acquisition. I remained quiet. Silence invites depth. He asked if we expected inheritance to supplement anything, Nathan continued carefully. And for the first time, I didn't know what to say. There it was. The question that had been hovering unspoken since I moved, not about entitlement, about expectation. What did you tell him? I asked. I said nothing is guaranteed. His voice was steady but thoughtful. And that felt strange. It shouldn't, I replied gently. Inheritance is not a retirement plan, it's a consequence of someone else's life. He exhaled slowly. I see that now. Later that week, Sophie requested a video call. Not a text, not a brief check-in. A conversation. She appeared on screen without her usual curated backdrop, no staged bookshelf, no filtered lighting, just her. I've been thinking about something you said, she began. That stability means choice. I nodded. I used to think growth meant constant expansion, she continued. Bigger properties, higher visibility, faster scaling, but we've been in the condo for 2 months now and I'm not anxious anymore. That admission surprised her more than it surprised me. Peace doesn't photograph well, I said quietly. She smiled faintly. No, it doesn't. She hesitated, then asked the question I had been expecting. Have you updated your estate plan since you moved? Direct, professional. But this time not opportunistic, curious. Yes, I answered calmly. Martin and I adjusted allocations to reflect current assets. She nodded. Is Nathan included? The room went still for a second. Not because I hadn't planned for this, but because tone matters. Nathan is included, I said evenly. As he always has been. She swallowed slightly. I'm glad. I held her gaze through the screen. Inclusion is not the same as control. She nodded again. I understand that now. That was new. Understanding layered ownership requires maturity. It means recognizing that access does not equal authority. A few days later, Nathan drove down alone. No announcement, no agenda. He stood in my doorway holding nothing but a small envelope. What's this? I asked. Our updated financial plan, he replied. I wanted you to see something. We sat at the table. He laid out projections, conservative growth models, debt ratios, savings targets, no speculative leveraging, no dependence on external equity. We removed any inheritance assumptions, he said plainly. I scanned the documents. They were disciplined, realistic, sustainable. Why show me? I asked. He didn't hesitate. Because I used to compare myself to you, to Dad. To what you built, I felt behind, and I thought access to your assets would level the field. He looked up. But it wouldn't have, it would have just delayed responsibility. That was the first time I saw him without armor, not the broker. Not the negotiator, just my son. Comparison distorts progress, I said softly. Your father built slowly, no one saw the early years, only the outcome. Nathan nodded. I think I was chasing outcome without respecting process. Edward's voice echoed in my memory, layered ownership. You build one foundation before stacking the next. You're correcting that, I said. That matters. He slid the envelope across the table. We don't need anything from you, I wanted you to know that. I didn't react dramatically, I simply nodded, because this wasn't about pride, it was about alignment. Before he left, Nathan stood on the balcony beside me. I was angry when you moved, he admitted. I thought you were withdrawing from us. I was withdrawing from expectation, I corrected. He smiled faintly. Fair. As he drove away, I felt something settle, not relief, not victory, resolution. The distance had done what proximity could not, it forced growth without confrontation. That evening, Martin Feldman called to confirm final trust documentation was filed. Everything is secure, he said, and flexible as always. Good, I replied, because legacy isn't about wealth alone. It's about what your decisions teach, and what they force others to confront within themselves. Sophie called 1 week later with a different tone entirely. We're hosting dinner next month, she said, small gathering. No real estate talk. I raised an eyebrow, though she couldn't see it through the phone. No leverage? I asked lightly. She laughed softly. No leverage. After we hung up, I stood at the window and watched the tide retreat. Relationships, like assets, require recalibration. Structure prevents collapse, but maturity prevents repetition. They had stopped asking what I would give them. They had started building what they could sustain. But there is still one final conversation left. Not about money, not about property, about forgiveness. Because growth fixes behavior, but it doesn't automatically heal trust. And when that moment arrives, they're going to learn something even more valuable than equity. They're going to learn that preparation protects assets, but forgiveness protects families. They thought growth would automatically restore everything. It didn't. Something else had to happen first. If you've ever rebuilt a relationship after boundaries were tested, you already know change in behavior is only the beginning. Trust requires something deeper. Nathan and Sophie invited me for dinner 3 months after our conversation about legacy. Their condo was modest, organized, intentionally furnished. No oversized statements, no rushed upgrades. The space felt earned. Sophie opened the door herself. No curated smile, just a steady one. "I'm glad you came," she said quietly. I stepped inside and took in the room. Neutral tones, clean lines, practical design. It wasn't aspirational. It was sustainable. That told me more than words could. Over dinner, conversation remained easy: work updates, community events, small stories about neighbors. No financial undertones, no subtle positioning. But there was something hovering beneath it. Finally, Nathan set down his glass. "Mom," he began, "we owe you something." I waited. He didn't rush the words. "Not money," he said. "An apology?" Sophie looked at him, then at me. "We treated you like a resource," she said plainly. No defensiveness, no explanation attached, just truth. I let the silence hold for a moment. Silence reveals sincerity. "You did," I said evenly. Nathan nodded. "We were embarrassed that we weren't where we thought we should be, and instead of adjusting our expectations, we tried to leverage yours." That word again, but this time not as strategy, as confession. Sophie's voice softened. "I equated proximity to your stability with entitlement to it. I thought if we positioned ourselves close enough, it would naturally extend to us." I studied her expression. There was no calculation in it now, only awareness. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked calmly. Nathan didn't hesitate. "Because we don't want our relationship defined by that season." That mattered, not because of pride, because of intention. I folded my hands on the table. "Forgiveness," I said carefully, "is not the same as restoring access." They both went still. "We understand," Sophie said quietly. "We're not asking for access." Good, that was the right answer. After dinner, Nathan and I stepped onto their small balcony. City lights flickered below. "I compared myself to you for years," he admitted. "To what you and Dad built. I thought I had to match it quickly." Edward's memory surfaced, the patience he carried, the way he would run numbers 3 times before making a move. "Your father never rushed structure," I said. "He respected process." Nathan nodded. "I'm learning that." There was no bitterness in him now, just maturity forming. "Do you forgive us?" he asked finally, direct, vulnerable. I didn't answer immediately. Forgiveness given too quickly can feel procedural. "I forgive the pressure," I said slowly. "I forgive the assumption, but trust rebuilds through consistency." He accepted that without protest. That was growth. Inside, Sophie was clearing plates when I returned. She looked up. "We're restructuring our 5-year plan," she said almost shyly. "Slow growth, no aggressive scaling. We realized we were building optics, not equity." I almost smiled. "Optics depreciate quickly," I replied. She actually laughed. Later that evening, as I prepared to leave, Sophie handed me a small framed photo. It was taken that night. The 3 of us at the table, no grandeur, no staged lighting. "Just presence for your new place," she said. I held the frame carefully, not because it was fragile, but because it symbolized something layered, not automatic restoration, intentional rebuilding. Driving back to Seabrook Cove the next morning, I considered the difference between protection and isolation. Boundaries protect. Isolation punishes. I had chosen protection. They had responded with correction. That is how relationships evolve without collapsing. A week later, Martin Feldman called to confirm final annual trust documentation. "Everything remains intact," he said. "No modifications?" "None," I replied. Because forgiveness doesn't require restructuring assets, it requires restructuring expectations. That afternoon, Nathan sent a message. We've started automatic investments, conservative index allocation. No speculation? I replied simply, consistency compounds. He responded with a thumbs up emoji, small but honest. The following Sunday, Sophie called unexpectedly. We're thinking about starting a family, she said softly. That sentence carried weight, not because it implied inheritance, because it implied continuity. That's a meaningful decision, I said. We want to do it right, she added, not fast, not big, right, that word mattered. When I ended the call, I stood at my window overlooking the water. The tide was steady, predictable, not dramatic. That's what sustainable relationships look like, not emotional surges, steady recalibration. They had grown. I had held my ground, but there is still one final layer to address: the future, because legacy isn't just about assets. It's about what you model when pressure arrives. And when the next test comes, and it will, they won't just remember the trust structure. They'll remember that preparation protected us, but accountability restored us. They thought the house was the story. It never was. If you've stayed with me this far, you already understand property was never the real conflict. Control was, expectation was, identity was. And what remains after all of that is far more valuable than square footage. 6 months after our dinner conversation, Nathan and Sophie came to Seabrook Cove again. This time, they didn't arrive carrying tension or unspoken agendas. Sophie stepped inside and placed a small envelope on my kitchen counter. Just something we wanted you to have, she said. Inside was a copy of their updated estate plan. Conservative, balanced, clear beneficiaries, no dependency clauses. No speculative projections. They had structured their future without factoring mine into it. That was the quiet victory. Nathan stood near the balcony doors looking out at the water. I used to think success meant acceleration, he said. Now I think it means durability. Edward would have approved of that sentence. I walked onto the balcony beside him. Durability requires restraint, I replied. Most people skip that part. He nodded slowly. I almost did. Almost. That word holds entire lives inside it. Sophie joined us, her expression softer than it had ever been during those early months. I was afraid of being average, she admitted. That's why I chased scales so aggressively. I thought if we didn't grow fast, we'd fall behind. I met her eyes. Behind whom? She smiled faintly. Exactly. Growth had changed the tone of their voices. Not dramatic transformation, just maturity. That evening, as we shared dinner overlooking the ocean, Nathan asked something he had never asked before. Mom, what made you decide to move, really? Not defensive, not strategic. Just curious. I considered the question carefully. When you both announced you were moving into my house without asking, I said calmly, I realized something important. If I allowed that assumption once, it would become precedent. They listened without interruption. I didn't move to punish you, I continued. I moved because I refused to live reactively. Selling the house wasn't about losing stability. It was about proving that my stability wasn't tied to one address. Sophie absorbed that quietly. Nathan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger but recognition. We underestimated you, he said. You underestimated yourselves, I corrected. Later that night, after they left, I sat alone with Edward's photograph on the side table. His steady gaze had watched every decision. Layered ownership, he used to say. Assets protected by structure, relationships protected by clarity, and clarity had been the missing layer all along. A week later, Martin Feldman called for our annual review. Everything remains exactly as you directed, he confirmed. Any revisions? I looked out at the horizon before answering. No revisions. Because legacy isn't reactive either, it's intentional. Nathan and Sophie didn't need to know percentages. They needed to understand principles, and they finally did. 3 months after that visit, Sophie called with news. We're expecting, she said, her voice trembling not with anxiety but wonder. I closed my eyes briefly. A new generation, a new layer, that's beautiful, I replied softly. We want to raise this child differently, she continued. Not chasing optics. Building foundations? I felt something settle inside me, not pride, relief. The cycle had shifted. When Nathan visited alone before the baby arrived, he stood again on my balcony, hands resting on the railing just as Edward once had. I used to think you were guarding assets, he said quietly. Now I realize you were guarding standards. That sentence mattered more than any inheritance ever could. Standards protect everyone, I said. Even when they don't see it yet. He nodded. I see it now. As the months passed, our relationship settled into something steady, not overly sentimental, not strained, balanced. Nathan stopped comparing timelines. Sophie stopped scanning rooms for leverage. And I stopped anticipating pressure where it no longer existed. One evening, as I watched the sun drop into the water, I thought back to that dinner, the announcement, the assumption, the moment I placed my napkin down and chose clarity over compliance. That was the pivot, not when I signed the trust, not when I sold the house, when I refused to react emotionally to pressure. Preparation is louder than reaction. I didn't need to shout, I didn't need to threaten. I structured, I repositioned. I moved forward, and in doing so, I gave them something far more valuable than access to property. I gave them a model of disciplined independence. The house they once tried to claim now belongs to another family. Children's laughter echoes in rooms where Nathan once ran as a boy. That's as it should be. Assets change hands, addresses shift, but standards, if taught correctly, remain. When my grandchild is born, they will grow up knowing this. Stability is not stagnation, preparation is not fear, boundaries are not rejection, and inheritance is not entitlement, it is a byproduct of integrity. The final truth is simple. The real estate was never the lesson. The real structure was us, and we are finally built on solid ground.